Have you ever had someone ask for forgiveness, but make no effort to change? That's called cheap grace. And yet, too many of us expect God's forgiveness without any real effort to live a different way. Grace is costly. It cost Jesus his life, and it costs us our lives too. Along the way, you'll be inspired by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran pastor who resisted Nazi Germany and lost his life in the process. This 4-week series will explore how God's grace enables us to make this costly commitment to live a transformed life.
If there's one thing I know about myself, I like to have as much information as I can before I make a decision. In a lot of situations, this is a real strength. Like, I take my time to make a decision, and then once I make that decision, I'm usually pretty confident. I don't tend to rush into things. I like to ask questions and gather information. I count the financial cost and the cost of effort for myself or what I'll be asking from others. I think about who I need to consult before or after making a decision. But sometimes that's not a strength. Sometimes it prevents me from moving forward. For instance, as I'm writing this sermon, I'm contemplating what we should do after our all-church service on Memorial Day weekend. I know that we're gathering at Potter Park Zoo in the Tiger Den, and it just makes sense for us to do something after the service to foster community. Something like inviting people to pack their lunches and eat lunch together. Or maybe we could offer a certain number of free tickets for people so that they can go to the zoo afterward. I bet we could do a connection card giveaway where we pull one of the completed connection cards and give that person free tickets. What if we even put together like a scavenger hunt that people could do together in the zoo? How do I decide? And if I can't decide, who should I talk to bounce these ideas off of? As soon as I decide, I'll let you know. Sometimes I get stuck in this spiral of information gathering, and I make things more complicated than they need to be. I can probably just pick any of those pretty good options and move forward. Today we're going to talk about God's call on us to discipleship, which I'll define in a couple of minutes, and the things that keep us from saying yes, including, but not limited to, getting stuck in a cycle of indecision. But first, let's pause here for a chat question. What is your decision-making mode of operation? Do you tend to make quick decisions, or do you get stuck for some reason? Take a minute and talk about it. We're in the middle of a series called Costly Grace, and it's based on the book, The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And we're going to talk more about who he is and what he did in a little bit. This series is part of a series of series that we have on the Sermon on the Mount, where we're taking topics that are in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus talked about, and they're inspiring us in our series. In this series, we're inspired by Jesus' words where he said, "You can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. The highway to hell is broad and its gate is wide for the many who choose the way, but the gateway to life is very narrow and the road is difficult and only a few ever find it." Following Jesus is difficult. It's a narrow way and it costs us something. And that's why we're calling this series Costly Grace. Now, in contrast to costly grace, Dietrich Bonhoeffer says that cheap grace is the justification of sin without the justification of the sinner. Cheap grace is the justification of sin without the justification of the sinner. That's kind of like saying we're expecting forgiveness without expecting real change. So today, our message is on the call to discipleship. Let's take a moment just to define discipleship. Discipleship is the state of being a disciple. Think about the disciples. We call them the 12 disciples. What did they do? They followed Jesus. I wonder what a modern word for disciple would be. Like kind of like a student, but the disciples were learning, but that's maybe too academic. Apprentice could be an option. That's a little closer. There's a lot of hands-on activity in apprenticeship. Mentee might even be closer than that, like a mentee-mentor relationship. Jesus was pretty hands-on in both their vocation and in their lives. Let's use a story of some disciples being called to follow Jesus to explore this call to discipleship more fully. This is from Matthew's account of Jesus' life and ministry. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee and preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. So here we have four of the disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And for each of them, Jesus calls them and they get up and they follow. They're not like called to a set of rules or a program to follow. They aren't called to prove themselves in some way. They're just called to follow Jesus. They're called to Jesus. And that's the call of discipleship. It's an invitation to follow Jesus that requires a decision. We're going to go pretty deep on that call to discipleship, exploring the what, the who, the why, and the how of this call. So to start, what is the call? The call is an invitation to obedience that opens the door to faith. As we just read, the disciples' call was to get up and leave their nets and their boats to follow Jesus. And they did. In their obedience, they created the opportunity to know Jesus and develop faith. But without that step, they might never have grown in faith. Let's contrast their story and their obedience with another story from Matthew's account of Jesus' life and ministry. This guy is often called the rich young ruler. He approaches Jesus with a sort of flattery, calling Jesus teacher, and then asking him a question about eternal life. Jesus doesn't really let him get away with much flattery and tells him that he has to keep the commandments. The young man presses further, which ones? Which ones do I need to keep? So Jesus lists some of them. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal or lie, honor your parents, love your neighbor as yourself. And the rich young ruler says, all these I have kept. What do I still lack? And Jesus answers, if you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. When the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. So Jesus extends the invitation to this young man to follow him. Jesus calls him to discipleship, and the young man walks away sad. His riches were too much to part with. When the call comes, the young man doesn't answer. Many people have debated over whether this is a universal call to poverty or if this was a specific one to this guy. I kind of think that Jesus knew exactly what button to push to make this man's call meaningful. This was costly. Remember that the disciples, they left their careers and their livelihoods. They weren't necessarily commanded to sell all of their possessions and give to the poor, but there's a good chance they didn't have as many possessions to start with. They didn't start out rich. And so in giving up their fishing nets, they gave up their safety nets. Bonhoeffer reflects on the rich young man's story. First, the young man must go and sell all that he has and give to the poor, and then come and follow. Discipleship is the end, voluntary poverty, the means. If God is calling you to discipleship, and I think God is, what is the means of that discipleship? What is God's call for you? And what will you decide? This invitation might be large in scale. There are calls that affect your whole life, like a call to be a pastor or a call to a different vocation. It could be a call to justice work and restoring shalom in our communities. These are calls that affect your whole life. Everything else fits around them. My call to be a pastor has meant moves for my family, lots of night meetings, weekends revolving around Sunday morning services, coordinating vacations so they don't conflict with Christmas or Easter. The cost of accepting this call has been great. This has been a costly grace in my life. But I think this invitation could also come on a smaller scale, like acts of obedience that are kind of quick. Your career and your place of living aren't changing, but this affects how you move within the already established lines of your life. For instance, it might be an invitation for you to apologize and repair harm that you've caused, or to forgive someone who hurt you and to let go of that bitterness. Maybe it's an invitation to bless someone with a small act of generosity or care through a note or a gift. Maybe the invitation to you is to have a difficult conversation that you've been putting off so that you can restore trust in that relationship. These invitations also cost something. They are a costly sort of grace, even when they come on a smaller scale. And they're steps of obedience that allow us to live with more wholeness and peace. What is God's call for you? And what will you decide? Let's stop here for another chat question. Talk about a time that you sensed an invitation to do good. This invitation might have come from God or from within you or your community. It could be big or small. And then how did you respond? Take a minute and talk about it. So that's the what. What is the call? Now let's move on to the who. Who acts in this call? The call is initiated by Jesus and requires a response from the would-be disciple. So there are two actors in this call. It doesn't really start with us, but it does require our participation. Bonhoeffer reflects on the call of one of the disciples. Christ must first call him, that is, the disciple. For the step can only be taken at Christ's word. This call to discipleship is grace, which calls him out of death into the new life of obedience. But we should completely misunderstand the nature of grace, the nature of the costly grace of discipleship. If we were to suppose that there was no need for us to take the first step because faith was already there. Bonhoeffer is basically saying you can't believe before you obey. Belief requires obedience. So the invitation to obedience is a grace from God. It's the call, and it requires us to make a decision to obey or not. There are two, or I should say at least two, schools of thought on how to bring about change in a person. One starts with the things that underlie our actions, like our thought patterns and our feelings, reasoning that when those things change, our actions will follow. Another approach begins with behavior. You don't have to think or feel a certain way to do something, and the feelings and thoughts will follow. Both approaches are effective in different situations, but I think what Bonhoeffer is suggesting is that when it comes to answering the call of discipleship, we just have to act. We have to take the step to obey. But the thing, though, is that discipleship really requires both action and faith. There's a tension here. Like, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? The faith or the obedience? Well, you can't have one without the other. Bonhoeffer writes of this paradox. Although Peter cannot achieve his own conversion, he can leave his nets. In the Gospels, the very first step a person must take is an act which radically affects their whole existence. What is God's call for you? And what will you decide? What is the invitation that God is extending to you today? Most likely, it will feel like a risk. Most likely, it requires you to leave something behind. Maybe something that offers you a sense of security. We've talked about the what and the who. Now let's ponder the why. Why do we make it so complicated? And the simple answer is we make it complicated because the call is costly. The call is costly. This is costly grace. It requires us to leave something behind. For the disciples, it was their nets, their boats, their livelihood. For the rich young man, it was his wealth. For others, it's the comfort of the place that we live. It's leaving our relationships or just leaving our way of doing things. And so for many of us, we respond with deflection. We act like we're stuck in moral complexities to avoid doing the simple good thing. If I imagine I'm one of the disciples, I imagine protesting that I'm leaving the people I provide for. It's not really responsible to leave such important supplies like a boat and nets. Like, what is the right thing to do in this situation? We use mental objections to avoid obedience. It's like pretending that we don't know the answer. Now, let me pause here and remind you that one of our core values at Sycamore Creek is curiosity. So I am not suggesting that you check your brain at the door. But I do want to encourage you to take God's call seriously and to ask yourself honestly, am I using these questions to avoid making a decision? We need faith and obedience. If you only focus on faith, working through your mental questions and objections, you have cheap grace, which is insufficient for discipleship. And if you focus only on obedience, you have a kind of fake grace. It's not grace at all because it depends on your actions. And this is also insufficient for discipleship. We need something different. We need a costly grace. Bonhoeffer reflects on Jesus' interaction with the young man. This Christ now confronts the young man with his call. The young man can no longer escape into the unreal world of his moral difficulties. The commandment is plain and straightforward. Follow me. The call to discipleship is costly. Peter and the other disciples left behind their livelihood, their careers, their means of provision. The rich young man was invited to leave behind his wealth, but he wasn't able to. What is God's call for you? And what will you decide? What cost is keeping you from saying yes to God's call? So in the call to discipleship, the what is an invitation from Jesus to follow him. The who is Jesus is the one calling us, and the would-be disciples who are faced with a choice. The why of our hesitation is that this call is costly, and it will require us to leave something. The how is, how do we live this in community? How do we become a community that encourages each other to say yes to the call? We practice saying yes. We say yes to small-scale invitations, like showing our kindness to someone who, in our minds, doesn't deserve it. Or like sharing an encouragement with someone who needs it. When we practice saying yes on a smaller scale, our obedience muscles gain strength and resilience so that we're ready to say yes to the large-scale invitations. And then we take one step at a time. This is my interpretation, not Bonhoeffer's. Bonhoeffer comes on pretty strong in his writing. It's a bit intense, which, if you remember his story from last week or have heard of his story, you might know that he lived in Germany and was part of the resistance to the Nazi movement. Like, you don't stand up to Hitler and Nazi Germany unless you have some kind of streak of fundamentalism or see things in like clear extremes. So I'm adding in some nuance here. I think we can get overwhelmed when we try to do the whole thing at one time. Like in my responding on God's call in my life to be a pastor, I didn't just wake up and then get a job at a church. I talked to people who could help me discern if this was really God calling me. I researched seminaries and submitted applications. I took classes. I practiced pastoral care and responsibilities under a mentor. I took it one step at a time. You might have heard it said that unless you get a clear sign from God, you just take the step that's right in front of you. Or if you're a Frozen 2 fan, you might be thinking of Anna's song, The Next Right Thing. Next, we share our stories of God's call on us for discipleship. What did God call you to? How did you make the decision to say yes? What did you have to leave behind? What did you find after obedience? In some traditions, we might call this our testimony. I think for a lot of us, that word has come to carry a lot of weight for something that is actually really simple. It's just telling our stories in community. And we can share stories of others who said yes. Folks like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Back in December, we had a series that told the stories of different mystic Christians and how they followed Jesus and how following Jesus impacted their communities. That's one of the ways that we can tell stories of Jesus' call on other people's lives. We can also tell stories of folks like Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who preached and organized for civil rights in the 1960s. We might tell the story of Mother Teresa, who worked to feed and care for the poor in India. We might tell the story of Pastor Barb Flory, who launched a new church community in South Lansing 25 years ago and called it Sycamore Creek. These are ways that we can tell stories of others who decided to say yes to a call to discipleship. And then finally, we get curious to hear other people's stories. Now, if you've been trained in Midwestern nice, this might not be your experience, but hypothetically, other people might sometimes enjoy talking about themselves and their own experience and then forget to ask questions or express curiosity to hear from others about their experiences. We got to develop mutual sharing by getting curious to hear from other people. And all of this will probably require you to spend some time reflecting. What is your story? When did you first respond to Jesus' call to discipleship? What is God's call for you? And what will you decide? Let's pause here for a final chat question. Tell a story of someone who inspires you, like Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, or someone else. Or if you're feeling really brave, talk about what it is God is calling you to today. We're moving together away from a cheap grace and fake grace and toward real, costly grace. Remember how Bonhoeffer said, cheap grace is the justification of sin without the justification of the sinner. It's the justification of sin without justification of the sinner. And that's expecting forgiveness without real change. It's thinking that the call to discipleship doesn't require a decision. It's thinking the call doesn't need any action or response on our part. But we have an important role to play. And a lot of times it's costly. Remember that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, you can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. The highway to hell is broad and its gate is wide for the many who choose the way, but the gateway to life is very narrow and the road is difficult and only a few ever find it. We have to let go of our need to overthink our yes to Jesus. I already told you that I'm the champion of overthinking decisions. I obsess over the nuances and the complexities in an effort to avoid making the wrong choice. And sometimes that level of thoughtfulness is helpful, but sometimes it gets in the way of forward movement. Like our after-service activity at Potter Park Zoo. As long as there's a chance to connect, there really isn't a bad option. So here we go. I told you that I would tell you when I made a decision. So bring a lunch on May 25th and plan to eat lunch with your friends after the service. We'll pay for everyone's parking, we'll do a drawing of the connection cards, and give away a set of tickets to the winner. Those who feel up for it can go explore the zoo together after lunch. Decision made. We're gonna have a blast.